Ever since Breath of the Wild came out in 2017 and was crowned a masterpiece open world, every single new hot title in the genre is immediately compared against it. Prudence of such comparisons aside, it was no different in case of Elden Ring, except this time Breath of the Wild was actually claimed as dethroned. Is it right though? As a player who never dared to come anywhere near the Dark Souls series, I wasn't sure if I should even jump on board of this train. Eventually I did, much in thanks to Arlo's glowing coverage of the game and a discussion I've had about it with a friend. Hi Clardy! It was intoxicating. Like a lightning flash, the moment I picked up the game, suddenly I have gained a higher understanding. All the reviews made perfect sense now! I struggled to put the game down. I would stay up at night just to play for a little longer. I was absolutely obsessed. By the time Arlo's Breath of the Wild 2 isn't in the best position right now video dropped, I genuinely agreed with his argument. He argued that in post-Elden Ring world, Breath of the Wild 2 has a whole lot to live up to, simply delivering more of the same might be short of enough now. Breath of the Wild walked so that Elden Ring could run. I've near 100%ed Limgrave area. I've fought my way through Stormveil Castle. I've trampled Godric the Grafted, an absolute Frankenstein beast, insane mess of ill-fitting limbs. Around this time, the honeymoon phase has ended, and first cracks in this glowing monument of a game started to become apparent. I wasn't struggling like I was afraid I'd be. In fact, surprisingly enough, I've been encountering very little resistance. So why did I feel so fatigued and frustrated? Red Dead Redemption 2 never made me feel that way, nor did The Witcher 3, and I've played both for much longer than I did Elden Ring. Not to mention Breath of the Wild, even after multiple hundreds of hours spent with the game, it remains fresh and fun. Coming back to it even now feels like returning home after a long and arduous journey. So why? Why would Elden Ring be different? I'm surprised by how much of a great case Elden Ring gives me to argue against using level up systems in long-form open-world games. Here's the deal. There are 8 different statistics your character has. Each level you gain gives you 1 point exactly to dump into the stat of your choice, with levels getting progressively more and more expensive as you go. Simple enough. First 3 statistics, Vigor, Mind and Endurance, govern your bars. Vigor increases your health, Mind gives you magic juice, and Endurance is stamina. No matter what type of character you build, you will be absolutely required to invest a sizable portion of your points into Vigor and Endurance at the very least. For magic users, you will need to invest into all 3. After that come stats that primarily govern your proficiency with weapons and spells. Strength and dexterity are for melee weapons, while faith and intelligence govern spell usage. As for arcane is basically the unloved child of the stat sheet. It only helps with an extremely narrow selection of weapons and spells. Already a great sign, I know. Anyway, out of these 5 remaining stats, you can choose to focus on one as your primary damage source, or if you want to, you can mix 2 or more of them. Beware though, every next point of investment is harder to come by than the last. The more you spread across these, the weaker your character will be overall when compared to someone of the same level. This system creates a lot of variety in possible playstyles, which on the surface sounds great. The issue with this, however, starts rearing its ugly head quite quickly. Firstly, the sheer variety offered by the stat sheet means that all, and I mean all, possible builds must be accommodated by pickups spread across the game world. The problem with that, when you have so many options on how to play, committing to one means that you will be disappointed with things you find for the majority of the game. Case in point, I played an intelligence build. I rarely get to play a spellcaster in games like that, so I gladly took the opportunity. Initially, I wasn't too upset about not finding things geared to my playstyle. Surely, if I look long enough, I'll find some cool spells on mage staffs. Other players need to be accommodated too, right? But I didn't. I dutifully combed through initial areas, finding plenty of various weaponry for strength and dex players, as well as plenty of casting items and spells for faith users. And then finally, I encountered the one-end spell merchant in the area, only to discover that the vast majority of options I could get there was some version of a boring blue missile. Comparing this with faith spells I managed to gather up till this point, poison clouds, frenzied flames, draconic magic, felt extremely disheartening. In other words, Elden Ring kept giving me fun toys and then promptly telling me that I can't play with them due to decisions I made blindly at the start of the game. What surprised me, however, was that this issue was not isolated to end builds. I thought that, wow, I'm finding so many things for the other free stats. Surely those players find exploration to be much more rewarding, but no! No! After taking to the internet, I had no trouble finding people on the other side of the barricade complaining about the same exact thing. Comparatively, Breath of the Wild handles the pickup problem with use of its most controversial feature, breakable weapons. Love them or hate them, I sincerely prefer them over Elden Ring's usefulness gamble. Because Link's weapons break, most, if not all weapon pickups across the game world are valuable, and their value is the same for all players. Just imagine how miserable it would feel if Zelda asked you to spec into a weapon type, you picked two-handed weapons, and then kept finding almost exclusively one-handed swords and spears for half of the game. That'd be fucking exhausting! But hey, at least in Breath of the Wild, you generally can see with your eyeballs what you're gonna get for engaging with an enemy. In Elden Ring, there is no such luxury. There are plenty of near copy-pasted ruins, caves and crypts scattered across the map. As a player, you have no way of knowing if clearing one of these will yield a reward that's useful to you and your build. That means that you have to either go in praying for the rewards to be good and inadvertently end up frustrated by the end, or take to the wiki. Praise be the wiki, by the way. As a result, the extrinsic motivations for exploring these locations are basically out the window. How about intrinsic motivations then? Actually playing through these places? To be completely honest, they don't feel any different to copy-pasted Ubisoft-style bandit camps. To be fair, Elden Ring devs did the absolute most with the asset pool they had at their disposal, and, at least for some time, layouts of all the different crypts felt unique. That sense of uniqueness, however, was eventually completely drowned out by the sheer number of those crypts. Combined with a very, very limited pool of possible regular enemies and a large amount of reused riskind bosses, clearing those quickly started feeling like a chore. By the time I found and killed my third watchdog statue, I was really sick and tired of fighting these things. So that was it for intrinsic motivation to explore these. Personally, I just ended up checking each with the wiki, praise be, before entering, just to make sure that going in was even remotely worth it. I think I ended up better for it. I'm not one to say that Breath of the Wild's monster camps are more creative than this. Hell, with how low the total amount of different monster types is in Breath of the Wild, these camps are even more repetitive than Elden Ring scripts. The thing with those monster camps though is that they never try to lure the player in by pretending that something good might be hiding just around the corner. As mentioned earlier, most of what you can get from attacking one is immediately visible, weapons currently wielded by the monsters and drops specific to their type. Some camps might have a chest with some bonus materials in it, but these are never unique and serve just as an extra reward, a fact that the player will pick up on very quickly. Thus, the motivations for clearing a camp like this most of the time are entirely intrinsic. The player fights because the player wants to fight. Breath of the Wild embraces this by making these camps really brisk and quick experiences to get through, while also providing multiple options for approaches by situating a specific camp type in specific terrain. Even without mentioning advanced combat tricks developed by the community, the amount of variables and methods for taking on such a camp is astounding for a game with a combat system so simple. Sometimes you just want to simply make it rain bomb arrows, you know? But I digress. Elden Ring isn't just caves and crypts though. How about everything else? Well, it's basically empty. It's giant plains and forests to ride through, with some materials to pick up, used for crafting items, which I never really did, as most of these were consumables. Why should I use them ever if I might just die to the current boss fight and essentially waste them? There were some generic enemies scattered around, sure, but tell me, how many times can you fight these using the same limited arsenal you locked yourself into every time before getting bored? I know that I did. I was exploring around, like you do, and having just slaughtered yet another group of generic soldiers but in different tabards this time, I felt really sick and tired of combat. And that, dear viewer, was the first time I realized how empty Elden Ring truly was. I rode around for a while, trying to find something to do with the rest of the session, but turns out there was literally nothing. The only thing Elden Ring actually has for gameplay is combat. If you don't feel like fighting, that means you don't feel like playing Elden Ring. Breath of the Wild does not have that problem, as its gameplay is based on three main pillars, combat being just one of them. Other two, puzzles and exploration, are what game falls back on if at any point combat gets tiring. If I don't feel like fighting more bokoblins, I can simply go out and look for some Korok seeds or shrines with entertaining puzzles to complete. Or I can go do some side quests too. More on those later. This constant gameplay back and forth helps to keep the game feeling fresh over prolonged periods of play. Meanwhile, Elden Ring's approach just isn't suited for these kinds of playtimes. It would work for a shorter, more linear game. In a massive open world though, well, by about halfway point, the game felt so stale to me that I just wanted it to end. But it kept going. This issue would be somewhat alleviated if Elden Ring didn't insist on stat and upgrade based approach. If I could make use of all those weapons I was showered with, then maybe combat wouldn't get so stale so quickly. But no. Elden Ring is too fascinated with number go up to ever do something like that. Because while, yes, I am gracefully allowed to respec my stats, if I can pay for it with a rare item, but I digress, this only solves the first half of the problem. The other half remains completely unaddressed. In Elden Ring, you don't just level up your character, no! You also level up the literal weapon you are using. To do that, you spend a large quantity of a fairly rare item and your experience that you could otherwise use to level up. If for whatever reason you want to stop using your current weapon and instead try something else, you can never get those upgrade items and experience back. This means that frequent changes of playstyle either come at a severe cost or make your character deal far less damage than before. Unless you are swimming in upgrade materials, any attempt at experimentation comes at a severe risk. For all intents and purposes, you are locking yourself into your weapon and, as an extension, your build. Conversely, Breath of the Wild allows for switching playstyles on the fly. Total amount of options available to the player is lower than in Elden Ring, sure, but despite that, or actually maybe because of it, the gameplay variety is much wider. Elden Ring wants you to pick your playstyle and commit, because it has to. If it didn't, the sheer array of available options would lead to choice paralysis. Breath of the Wild doesn't have that limitation. Between 3 different weapon types, bows with various arrows, runes and physics, it creates complexity without completely overwhelming the player. This means that players can choose how they want to approach combat encounters, mix and match at will, plan their attacks and either see those plans come to fruition or panically try to salvage the situation when something goes wrong. Oh, also, I nearly forgot. I feel for all unfortunate souls who at the start of their Elden Ring playthrough chose to lock themselves into spellcaster like I did. Early to mid-game, it is viable enough. Late-game story bosses, however, are a different breed. The way this game scales, you are always approximately 2 to 3 hits away from being dead, with only very short windows for retaliation. Thus, I wish us all good luck with finishing the lengthy casting animation before getting smacked in the face. I'll be completely honest, I would not be able to win against Malenia without receiving help from another player running a melee build, just to provide the boss with a durable target while I spammed my spells. Again, if not for the incessant upgrade and level up systems, this wouldn't be an issue. If I'm allowed to change my style of play however I want, whenever I want, not all options have to be equally good. Breath of the Wild's bomb rune can be used offensively and many players do use it that way, simply because it's fun to do so. But if the bombs turn out to be insufficient, the player can fall back on literally anything in their arsenal. But if using bombs would be mandatory due to some decisions player made way earlier, then it is reasonable to expect that bombs would be about as good as other weapons. By the same principle, if spellcasting is a choice the player is expected to lock themselves into, why is it near impossible to cast anything in late game boss fights without aid? For real, FromSoft, my buddy, my pal, why even include spellcasting as an option if the game itself makes this option completely unviable? Wouldn't it be better to cut it and make a more focused and tighter designed game instead? Speaking of focus, Elden Ring struggles with openness of its design constantly. It lets you loose out into this massive world only to then expect you to follow the critical path. If you don't, you are going to miss critical tutorials and take much longer to meet this lady, which is important because meeting her is required to level up. I wish I was joking. Similarly, things as important as the ability to respec your character are completely missable if you don't pursue a specific optional story boss. I'm getting flashbacks to Pokemon's high-tech earbuds right about now. Breath of the Wild, again, does not have such problems. All mandatory equipment and tutorials are placed within a portion of the map that is sectioned off and safeguarded by the game itself so well that even speedrunners haven't come up with a way to get past it yet. And that's saying something. You are required to get everything you will need going forward before you are allowed to leave on your journey. But Draken, I hear you say, what about that combat tutorial shrine in Kakariko? That's missable. Technically, yes, but while monk calls skills taught in that shrine essential, they really aren't. You can play through the entire game just fine, not knowing parries and flurry rushes are a thing, or alternatively, you can stumble upon these mechanics yourself. Either way, missing this tutorial won't leave you without access to core tools, quite the same way like missing Melina in Elden Ring will. I also constantly found myself doing questline events out of order, with dialogue often not reflecting what happened at all. Not to mention many of these questlines being incredibly cryptic as it is. Example, when first meeting this guy, you are supposed to come back to a character you met earlier who gave you exactly 0 indication he'd know this wolfman, to then receive a gesture for multiplayer. Then you return to the wolfman, perform the gesture at him, which gets him to come down from his tower and talk to you. He tells me that he's searching for someone. Name didn't tell me much, so I figured maybe it will come up later. Unsurprisingly, it did not. Eventually, I gave up and went to the wiki, praise be, only to learn that Botw has moved to a boss fight spot where I have already been long ago. Because I already completed the boss fight, I expected Botw to comment something on that and move on with the questline. Instead, he congratulated me, clearly suggesting that he helped in that fight, which he would if I hadn't already beaten it. Things like that happened a lot. Characters move constantly, often with little to no indication as to where you can expect to find them next time, which is a slight problem if your game is a massive open world. What am I supposed to do when a character moves without telling me where to exactly? Truly, praise be the wiki. This, combined with a long list of different triggers for questline progression, means that entire story beats are completely missable, making the already pretty weak questlines suffer even more. Because, yeah, calling these questlines is pretty generous. Most of them are comprised of some dialogue, then character moves, some more dialogue in a new location, character moves, rinse, repeat. In my case, these questlines were basically absent from early to mid-game, after which, seeing that conclusion of the game is not far away, I opened the wiki, praise be, and rapid-fire completed all that I could remember. What a great quest design! Funnily enough, this great quest design is greatly hindered by this open world being, surprisingly, very linear in nature. Once an area is completed, there's basically no reason to ever return. So if a character happened to move somewhere I've been to already, without telling me where they went, the chance I'd find them again on my own were exactly 0. I understand that From Software didn't want to clutter their map with Ubisoft-style markers, but surely leaving a few more reasonably findable hints and maybe a conversation log to record the dialogue player heard 40 hours ago wouldn't be too much to ask, would it? Don't get me wrong, Breath of the Wild's side quests weren't exactly groundbreaking, but at the very least, they didn't expect me to comb the entire world map multiple times in hopes of finding an NPC again. The only case of an NPC wandering off without saying exactly where to find him again is Hestu, but get this. Developers, in their wisdom, left a pretty useful hint in his dialogue and then placed him in not just one, but 2 different locations, both of which happen to be high traffic to increase odds of finding him again without outside aids as much as possible. As for other quests, a lot of them are just simple fetch quests, which isn't great by today's standards. However, given that this is still much more involved than what Elden Ring is doing, what does that say about Elden Ring's questlines? And mind you, fetch quests are the worst of what Breath of the Wild has to offer. There's a quest tasking the player with finding a missing Zora, walk down the river, escorting a letter in a bottle, tube, down that river, a house ownership quest, a game-spanning story of building and populating an entire town, many riddle shrine quests, a guy in dire need of someone to perform a rescue operations for his friends, and much, much more. Again, Elden Ring's idea for what a questline should look like is by far better suited to a more linear game. If the game is linear, then by all means, move an NPC without telling the player where to. Just make sure to put them at a point on the map that is actually ahead of the player. But in a massive open world, it just doesn't translate. Speaking of the map, remember when I said that Elden Ring likes to reuse bosses? This is obviously a cost-saving measure to pad out the playtime without creating too many new assets. To be clear, I don't exactly have a problem with that, all games do it one way or the other, though Elden Ring is really overdoing it in my opinion. What I do have a problem with is when a game creates this set piece of a boss fight with beautiful atmosphere and fitting arena and then forgets that it is set in an open world, puts the same boss elsewhere without all that flair and then does nothing to prevent the player from encountering the copied one first. Falling Star Beast is a good example of this. It is supposed to be first encountered in this crater on top of a mountain as a last fight of the climb to the top. I encountered it first in a random hole by a city wall. Meanwhile, someone else might have fought it for the first time in a random mine on the other side of the map. Apparently, even special bosses aren't exempt from this. This thing, Astel, is supposed to be the capstone of the most involved side quest in the game. You can also find him in this random tunnel in the snowfield, and yes, you can find this version first. Kinda ruins the intended moment, doesn't it? This is especially problematic when boss fights are literally the point of the game. Breath of the Wild obviously reuses its field bosses like crazy. The difference is that none of them are supposed to be this big and important story moment, and that those boss fights aren't the selling point of the game. If there is any piece of content, Elden Ring should put utmost care into making sure it is the best it could possibly be. It's the boss fights. Then why? Why should Astel into its metaphorical knee and reuse it instead of letting it be memorable, one-of-a-kind encounter? Breath of the Wild has boss design problems of its own, but at least it didn't stuff Waterblight into a random cave for crying out loud. At this point, after 20 minutes of nothing but complaints about the game, you'd be justified in thinking that I absolutely hate Elden Ring. But in truth, I don't. I actually kinda love it. At its core, Elden Ring is a genuinely good game. It's just simultaneously empty, bloated beyond belief, and ill-fitted to the open world format. The highlights of the game weren't open world portions, hell no. My favorite parts were the castles. These intricate, tightly designed levels, often looping in on themselves, with many different shortcuts, Metroidvania style, forcing me to create a mental map of the place and navigate it to find a unique boss fight at the end. Those were the best parts of the game. The absolutely stunning, striking visual design only served to strengthen them. Despite Halistri regularly kicking my ass, I'd take being there over an open field in Altus any time of the day. It's by far more interesting, both to look at and play through. That extends even to Malenia. Despite my previous complaint, I actually enjoyed this boss quite a bit, for the community spirit it instills. I wouldn't have beaten her on my own, sure, but I wasn't alone. The sheer amount of people willing to lend their aid in the fight is astounding. In truth, the experience was cathartic, the comfort of knowing that no matter what, someone will have my back juxtaposed against the grim setting. After I started summoning, we were able to dispatch Malenia within a few tries. My two partners engaged with her in a melee dance of a combat, while I was able to fire away my frost missiles, rocks, and massive blue lasers of death. By the time she went into her second phase, we were all still standing strong. Aeonia bloomed as we continued hacking away, and then she fell. There was jumping for joy and celebration, the moment shared between us three, complete strangers, yet brothers through combat. I've never experienced anything quite like that in a game. Thus, even after beating the final boss and rolling the credits, I stayed, offering my aid to other tarnished in need. There were great many failures and a few successes. There was kindness, mutual understanding, there was community. Which brings me all the way back to the initial question. Was Breath of the Wild actually dethroned by Elden Ring as the crowning achievement of the open world genre? No! Not by a long shot! Breath of the Wild revolutionized the open world format. To this day, it remains the most unique entry in the genre, with clever back and forth with its gameplay elements, overall cohesion, utilization of the world, and sense of freedom all those elements provide. By comparison, Elden Ring falls short in these aspects, leading to fatigue and frustration. It is simply a bad open world game. However, buried under that open world coating is a game worth playing.